All right. Well, again, thank you all for coming. I know some of you have already let me know you can't stay that long or are en route elsewhere, and Nora is en route from somewhere else to join us a little late. I'm gonna turn off this transcript thing. Um, I think maybe I've only met a few of you before. I'm Colin. I have practiced a lot as a public defender, but all entirely in Louisiana. Um, I came to Oregon about a year and a half ago, and I've only been at OPDC for 4 months. So in my past work, I worked a lot with performance standards. So I'm familiar with that, but I have not practiced delinquency law. I did work with kids. I had handled a bunch of Miller and Montgomery cases, but I will be deferring to you all as the experts, and I'm here to guide the process along. Um, the goal, the long overdue, as I understand it, goal is to get juvenile specific or delinquency specific standards drafted by OPDC. And I will say that the timeline is not clear. As I'm sure you all know, we've been a lot of changes at OPDC, and where this project falls on the priority list is not clear yet. But we're just going to keep chugging along until we're told to go faster or slower, is my thinking at the moment. The one thing I should say in terms of the goal, I mean, we want performance standards, and there's tons of performance standards out there from different jurisdictions, and then there's the state bar combined criminal delinquency standards, any one of which we could decide is our baseline starting point, or not, or we could start from scratch if we really want to. The one caveat to that is that a major goal of the agency is to have at least some parts of what our product is be things that can be measured in some way in a that aren't entirely subjective, which I think is a challenge, but is part of the goal, and even if they are certainly imperfect metrics, um, things like uh, are you visiting your client is measurable as a piece of assessing an attorney's performance. Um, so I guess that's a lot of what I wanted to say as background. Welcome, Nora. I think the one other thing I wanted to say before kind of opening it up a little bit was I think another thing we should talk about today is well, as I said, the timeline is a little bit ambiguous, but in terms of moving the process forward, it would be helpful to get some regular times on the calendar. So hopefully before people have to drop off, we can talk about whether we want to keep this as a regular time every so often, or if it's easier for me to send a doodle regularly because people's calendars are hard to predict. But I did want to open it up for anyone to either give different thoughts on how where we should start from, or or other opinions on kind of process moving forward.
Hi, I'm Liz. Nice to meet you virtually. I guess I'm curious what, if anything, the adult criminal is doing. I know when we were meeting about the whatever the first part of the stuff was called, one of the considerations was there are people who do both, and so where appropriate, we had talked about sort of trying to keep them parallel.
Yeah.
We can't do that completely, but it might be helpful to know what they're doing on the adult criminal side.
Yeah, they're having their first meeting Wednesday, and I'm gonna be attending that. So I think as much as possible. So Jordan from our office is going to be heading up that group. And I think as much as possible, we will work behind the scenes to try to make sure that things are on track together and that anything that needs to overlap can be overlapped. And we can decide as a group whether we want the end product to mirror kind of what the state bar's standards are and divide out things that are juvenile specific, or if we want to keep them entirely separate, acknowledging that there are places where they should overlap and mirror each other's language. So so we can do that either way, but I think I will bring back to you updates on what's happening on the criminal side, adult criminal.
Thank you. Thanks. Once you get outside of Multnomah County, there are a lot of practitioners who do both.
Yeah.
And creating totally separate sets of guidelines and expectations, just as a practical matter for lawyers, if we want to make something that's useful and practical for lawyers to read and understand, I just think we need to keep that in mind. And I see Matt nodding in agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I spent many years doing literally everything that you can be appointed to represent people on in Central Oregon. So, we could be as consistent as possible. That would be super helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure we'll make them consistent. I think to Liz's point, it's a open question whether we want to break them out into separate juvenile standards or just have juvenile and adult together in a single document. But maybe I guess if we decide we want to take criminals' product and augment it, we can let their process play out and come back. But I don't know if there's how much we want to rely on their process.
I guess I have another question, and anybody else is welcome to talk. Is there a clear idea of how OPDC wants to be able to use these? You had mentioned, something to create some sort of a measure. But if you could kind of talk about what OPDS is anticipating, maybe that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, at the most basic level, 337 required us to have performance standards, and we don't. So we need to have, step one is we need to have some performance standards. But in terms of what the goal is, what the thinking is about how to use those, I think the goal would be right now when we get feedback about attorneys, we don't have anything to set it against in terms of us coming in and saying, well, we think you should take these CLEs or find a mentor or take this training that OPDC maybe one day will develop and promulgate. And if we had performance standards, then we could say, we think you're not meeting this specific performance standard, and so we'd like to see improvement in that area. And our goal is to, help attorneys improve. Obviously, if someone is really egregiously and consistently not meeting a specific performance standard, it would be also the agency's goal / obligation to figure out a way to address that one way or the other. But I think right now it's a lot without having performance standards, figuring out ways to help improve the practice is a lot more challenging. So we need something to compare what's happening or what we see against what ought to be happening. Does that answer your question?
I think that's as much of an answer as I think anybody from OPDC can provide. I don't mean to be dismissive when I say that, because I understand that there's nothing, and you get complaints, and if there's nothing to hold the measure against, then it's really just a bar complaint, and there's not a lot the agency can do. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to be maybe slightly more specific, I think right now they're having resource counsel like me do a lot of administrative stuff at the agency. Um, and there is talk, I don't know what will come of it, but there's talk that they will take some of that administrative stuff away eventually and have us doing more proactive work to improve the practice, which could be creating trainings or going into various jurisdictions and working directly with providers. Um, so that's maybe part of the vision of what performance standards could be useful for, but I don't know the timeline for that.
I'm sorry I was late. What is the, and I'm sorry if I missed this already, what is the ideal time frame for completing these standards? And I guess sort of where have we left off with the standards that we were working on with KO back in 2024, last year?
So in terms of timeline, I did briefly mention before you logged on that I don't really know. We had been on a timeline that where the goal was maybe August. But I don't know, but that was under a previous executive director and a previous resource council manager. And we haven't gotten more guidance since then. And I'm not sure August is realistic. But it's also mandated in the statute and they're overdue. So I suppose at any point someone could say, whatever you got, put it together in 2 weeks and we'll run with it. So I think we just start going and see how long it's taking. And part of my job will be to report back and complain if they're trying to get us to go too fast, or be realistic about what the work product's going to be. And then to your other question, I think what you're referring to is the qualification standards that we were you were working on with KO.
Yeah, those were different. Yeah,
those were in front of the commission to be approved at their most recent meeting 2 weeks ago, but then they ran over and didn't get to them.
okay.
But I think maybe they'll go in front of the commission in May. But I think the executive team has signed off on them, and we got one round of feedbacks from the commission, and we think that they'll approve what you all developed.
Okay.
So that's go. So that and then that would start being implemented,
Right.
whether or not, regardless of where things stand with the performance standards.
Okay.
Could you send whatever the most recent version of those are? I mean, I was at most of the meetings, but December was a long time ago now.
Yes,
So-
I will circulate those. To
You're
my knowledge,
reminded
other
of
than
those.
formatting and a few like minor structural things, I think most of what y'all proposed ended up being in the final product.
Okay. And so in terms of performance standards, are we thinking of I mean, I know that for the state bar, the performance standards for juvenile and criminal are sort of merged, right? Which I think is something that Liz was sort of alluding to.
Right.
But I also know that for like NJDC, which I think is now known as the Gold Center, they're standalone. Are we thinking of doing some kind of like working off of either one of those documents as a starting point?
Yeah, I mean, I think of all the documents in the Dropbox, those two stood out to me as the most likely places to start. But I do, as I was saying, I kind of defer to you all as the experts, both in terms of delinquency practice, but also in terms of the reality of working in Oregon, about whether it makes sense to start from a more generic place like the state bar that has the adult and delinquency in a single document, or if it makes sense to start delinquency specific,
right,
like the Galt centers. And I don't personally have an opinion. I think we could start one way, and if it's not, and my job is to facilitate making this as easy as possible for you all. So if we need to pivot, I'll figure out how to make it pivot. But whatever you all thinks that would make it most helpful for practitioners, I think, keeping in mind also the goals of the agency to make it useful to improve the practice, um, then that's fine with me. And I'm happy to advocate at the agency level for a combined adult and delinquency if that's what the group thinks makes more sense. But I don't think I've been in this long enough to have a strong opinion.
It seems, and you guys can correct me if you think I'm off base here, but um, it seems like you could start with the criminal standards as a baseline and then supplement those with, I think, the extra things you need to do as a delinquency attorney. I don't know if Liz or Nora think I'm off base on that, but I'm trying to think of what things as a adult criminal attorney you would not need to do as a juvenile delinquency attorney. And I don't know if there's anything in the standards about jury trials, although I admit I haven't looked at them recently.
I was just looking at that today, and the Oregon state bar standards do have jury trials in there, but interestingly, and I think probably good for us, actually it says in the preamble to this Oregon State Bar adult criminal and delinquency merge standards that they wrote it like right when the Galt Center standards had just come out, and there's a lot of places where they footnote that and reference that. So it seems like they did a lot of work. I don't have an opinion on whether it's where it needs to be, but they did a lot of work, at least theoretically, to incorporate those standards into the adult standards. So it might be a matter of just seeing what needs to be improved or changed in that, or you could decide that it's too merged and doesn't make and it's not useful. KO did note for me in her transition memo that one thing definitely lacking in that document is waiver related standards and JPAR related standards. And then she also flagged that the ongoing challenge for us to figure out how to put in standards is post disposition.
Yep. Yes. So I was just looking at my computer. Back in 2023, KO and I actually set out to revise the state bar standards. And we seem to have never quite finished that project, but I have a copy of, I think, where we left off, to the extent that that's useful. We were sort of, I was just looking back through it, sort of revising the standards to make them delinquency specific. And if it's useful at all as a starting point, I can circulate that document, which has it's track change. So there's like my edits and KO's edits and our comments in the margins about this, that, and the other thing. And I think I had started writing standards for waiver hearings, but I don't think, again, this was like a project that we were working on that I don't know that we ever quite finished. But yeah, if it's helpful, as a starting point, I'm happy to circulate that since it seems.
I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't want to at least start it. I mean, look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is Deanna. That sounds particularly helpful.
Okay.
Thank you, Nora.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll email this out. Yeah.
Thank you. And Matt, I know you only have about 5 minutes before you have to go. Do you have is this a good time for you, or is it better if I send out a doodle poll before next meeting?
Yeah, you can send out the poll. That's fine. I'll take a look at
Okay.
it.
Okay. I don't want to overwhelm folks with polls, but I know that week to week people's schedules aren't always the same.
I'll just add that 1:30 is frequently not good for me because that's when we have new cases that come in Clackamas County is at 1:30. And so I don't always know if I'm going to be needed or not.
Got it.
All right, I'm gonna send this now.
Nora, do you have thank you for doing that, Nora. Do you have
Mhm.
I don't know how much you remember from when you worked on that with KO, but does that, having started that process, do you
Mhm.
think that completing it with the state bar standards as the kind of baseline starting point is a logical way to go forward, or
That's what
versus
seemed to, I
starting
mean, we
with
were
like the
obviously
galt
working
center?
on the state bar standards, but I
Right.
think generally, yes, like they provide at least a logical structure and framework. And then we were using, I think all of the stuff that's probably in the Dropbox, which was like, chiefly the Galt Center standards. And then we also had the ABA standards. We had NACDL, 10 principles, DC practice. I mean, we just had like, I don't even know how many. I can send it's huge, a huge file.
Nora,
Yeah,
I, I think that, I think that Colin sent most of that out because I
yes,
was going
yes,
through
I
it the
think
other
he
day.
did. Yeah.
Because you guys had found a whole bunch of different state standards that you'd pulled
Correct.
together. Kudos
Yeah,
for
I think
doing
it's
that.
the
'Cause
same.
yeah, it was a big,
Yeah,
a big,
I think it's probably the same.
yeah.
So anyway, I'm gonna send you all the what I had as the most recent version of the standards that KO and I worked on. It's possible that there was a later draft and I don't have it saved. That
And
would
I'm
not
kind of
surprise
surprised that
me.
KO didn't leave that. Maybe I can find it somewhere in her
Yeah,
old
I don't know
files,
where
but
she kept it.
yeah,
Um,
I'll do a search. She might have just forgotten that
yeah,
you all started that.
it was back in 2023, so it was a while ago. But anyway, forgive. I mean, it's like I said, it's definitely a work in progress. But here you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think,
So yeah.
well, I was just going to say that I guess another kind of overarching question is, that both Galt and the State Bar and lots of others, list the standards and then have commentary about
Mm-hmm.
the standards. And I think, Galt has more of what the State Bar puts as commentary. Galt made part of the standards.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really know the I don't know how to figure out whether it matters and or necessarily the value of the commentary. I mean, I guess it depends on how it's going to be used to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that'll be something that I'll certainly be talking about within the agency about how to how to conceive of the structure. But I think if there's a thing to think about as we look at the different types of standards is whether there's stuff that is currently commentary, but that we think needs to be elevated, and also
Right.
whether or not there are things we want to, even if there are things we don't think can be standards, that we want to make sure to include as commentary because we think it might have some value down the road. But I don't really know
Yeah.
how that process worked or how things ended up being in one place or the other.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that was something again with the state bar stuff that KO and I had talked about, and just we had talked about writing commentary, and then because that project slid by the wayside, we never got around to it. But yeah, and I think that's really a decision for the agency about how much it wants to get into the nitty gritty on it. Yeah, so, or if it just wants to like up the Galt's commentary, but anyway.
Great. Nora, I got the email. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know what, I guess, I don't know, moving forward, if we want to break and look over what Nora just circulated as a starting point and come back together at, in a couple weeks, or if more discussion makes sense first.
I have a question for Nora.
Yeah.
Just so that when we go through and read the standards, can you describe kind of, were you going to take this as a separate standalone set of delinquency standards, or were you going to merge it, or how had you considered the issue of the practitioner, the sort of practicalities for a lawyer in some place who is doing both and having to manage two sets of guidelines? Can you just how you?
I'm trying to remember. I think the idea was that it was going to be standalone because, and now I feel like I should double check with KO. Sorry, my memory is such crap. I believe that the idea had been that there should be standalone delinquency standards because delinquency practice is different in many ways. The nuances of it certainly are different than criminal practice. And so it wasn't serving practitioners to have just one set of standards that were primarily geared toward criminal, and that it conveyed the message that practitioners who just did criminal law could sort of just easily jump into delinquency without understanding where there are differences, and why you need to have somewhat of a different approach when doing delinquency cases. By that same token, it was also that, practitioners that just did dependency couldn't, they needed to understand that doing delinquency wasn't just like representing a kid in a dependency case, that it was this, it's really its own practice. And it draws from both, but it's not, you can't just understand criminal and totally be able to do delinquency. You can't understand dependency. My kid's here because he's sick. Yeah. There might be one. Yeah. I'm not sure.
I need one.
Okay, can you hold on?
Do you have like a back battery?
Maybe. So anyway, that's my recollection of why we were doing it that way, because a lot of the stuff you'll see in there is like really rejiggering it to speak directly to delinquency practice, as opposed to sort of trying to fit a criminal standard into a delinquency mold. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it kind of goes back to my original thoughts when we started this meeting, which was sort of deciding how, or thinking through how and why we might want to create standalone standards, and to the extent they can sort of mirror the adult criminal standards, it would make a lot of sense. But I also know that NJDC has always favored a standalone model, like its own set of standards. And so I can understand there's pros and cons to both sides, and
Yeah.
I guess I don't feel like I have a dog in that fight, but I feel like deciding that might make life easier for us.
Mhm.
Or just going through it as separate might make it easier if we then later have to merge it. I don't know. I think it would be harder to extract it from a set of joint standards than it would be to eventually have to merge it if we had to merge it.
Mhm.
I mean, it sounds
Yeah.
like extracting it from joint standards is what you and KO were starting to do, Nora.
Right.
Yeah, that
That's
was,
what they are, right?
yeah, I mean, I think that was the idea, was that a lot of the bar standard, a lot of the joint bar criminal and delinquency standards, were missing big pieces that were important to delinquency cases. And so they weren't giving practitioners as much guidance as they could. And I think that that's especially true when you start thinking about waiver, which doesn't exist in the criminal world, right? And like, yeah, and just, I mean, that's a whole other can of worms. Oh, and I should probably find where we had started sort of thinking through the waiver stuff, because I have that somewhere. You see if I can capture it. Let's see.
Liz, to your point, I tend to agree that if we just come up with what we think the delinquency standards should be, if at the end the consensus among like either at the agency side or from this group is that actually it would be better to merge them, then I can do a lot of that and try to bring it back to the group after we know what the language should be. But I think if we all get on the same page about what the delinquency content is, then we can put it in whatever format we decide.
So I
And
have,
it just so you
sorry.
know, I just was scrolling through what you had sent around, and you have the sort of on the last couple of pages, there's an outline from you and KO with obligations of counsel post disposition and a section for representing clients facing waiver proceedings.
Oh,
where
we
you
do have
kind
it in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly like
It's
this is sort of
skeleton.
yes, it's the skeleton that you haven't
Yeah.
filled in. So,
Okay,
but you
cool.
have it in there. So,
Okay, good.
um,
I had a separate document with the skeleton of representing clients facing waiver proceedings, but I didn't scroll down long enough, I guess, to see that it was actually included in some
Yes.
form. So, okay. Oh, yeah, I see it. Yeah. Oh, yes, an incomplete skeleton to be sure. But
I mean, it's easier to start with something than it is to create the skeleton.
Yep.
So,
Mhm.
thank you very much for creating that for us.
sure. Yeah.
I don't know. For myself, I guess I'd like to sort of take time to read through it,
Yeah.
just so that if I have thoughts, I can write them down and know what they are. I don't know what Kevin or Deanna are thinking at the moment.
No, I mean, I think I absolutely agree. And I do apologize. I'm driving to a home visit. I agree that like being able to like look at that and make notes and come back together would be the most logical next step, I think.
Great. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'll go ahead and put Nora what Nora sent in the Dropbox, and then I think Dropbox should let us add commentary there if we work off that document. I think it has a kind of group edit feature. Um, And so, and I will also put the recording of this meeting in the Dropbox and then send out a summary of what we discussed so that folks who couldn't make it or who had to drop off early, hopefully will have a chance to look at what Nora sent, and then we can come back with thoughts in a couple of weeks. Thank you all. I really appreciate taking the time for this.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing.
Yeah.
All right. I'll talk to you all in a little bit.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Colin.
Have a good
Bye.
day.
Bye.